I was standing in the snow with a suitcase in one hand and my father's trembling arm in the other when I realized my brother had finally done it. He'd thrown us out. Not just me. His sister, the one who'd stayed up nights when Mom got sick, who'd changed Dad's sheets when he couldn't do it himself. But Dad too. Our father. The man who'd built that house with his own hands 40 years ago. And my kids. Sophie was 7. Matthew barely 2 months old. Wrapped in a blanket so thin I could see his breath fog the air. Richard stood in the doorway, his wife Beatrice behind him with her arms crossed, and he said the words I'll never forget. "You've been a burden long enough, Emily. Figure it out." Then he closed the door. The lock clicked. I heard it echo in my chest like something breaking. The wind cut through my coat like it was made of paper, and I could feel Sophie's small hand gripping mine so tight her nails dug into my palm. If you're new here, thank you for listening. This channel is just getting started, and every day we'll share a new story. Real people, real struggles, real hope. If this one moves you, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before Sophie tugged my coat. "Mommy, where are we going?" I didn't have an answer. I had $43 in my wallet, a car that hadn't started in 2 weeks, and a father who could barely stand without help. The suitcase wasn't even mine. It was Mom's old one, the brown leather kind with brass buckles that didn't latch anymore. I'd grabbed it on the way out because Richard was shouting and I wasn't thinking straight. Inside were some clothes, a few of Matthew's diapers, and something I didn't know about yet. Something that would change everything. But that night, all I knew was cold. The kind that gets inside your bones and stays there. The kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. We walked to the bus stop. Dad didn't complain, but I could see his lips going pale, the way they did when his circulation was bad. His breathing came in short, shallow bursts, little clouds of vapor that disappeared into the darkness. Sophie held his hand and kept asking questions I couldn't answer. "Where are we sleeping tonight? Can we go back tomorrow? Is Uncle Richard mad at us?" Matthew started crying, that sharp newborn wail that cuts through everything. I tried to rock him, but my arms were shaking too hard. A woman at the stop looked at us, not with pity, exactly, more like she was deciding whether to get involved. She glanced at her phone, then back at us, then at the approaching bus. She didn't say anything. When the bus came, I helped Dad up the steps, one at a time, and the driver gave me a look that said he'd seen this before, too many times. The municipal shelter was 3 miles across town. I'd never been inside, but I'd driven past it plenty of times, always thinking it was someone else's problem. Now it was mine. The building was gray concrete, flat and ugly, with a metal door that stuck when you pushed it. Inside smelled like industrial soap and old coffee, and something else I couldn't name. Desperation, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of too many broken lives passing through. A woman at the desk, her name tag said Gloria, asked if we had identification, if we'd been residents of the county for more than 6 months, if anyone in our party had a contagious illness. I answered yes, yes, no. She handed me a clipboard. "Fill this out. We'll get you a bed." A bed. Singular. Dad sat on a plastic chair by the window, his head tipped back, eyes closed. His hands were shaking in his lap, and I could see the veins standing out on the backs of them, purple and prominent. Sophie pressed against my leg, her face buried in my coat. Matthew had finally stopped crying, but only because he'd worn himself out. His little body was limp against my chest, and I could feel his heartbeat, fast and fragile. I filled out the form with a pen that barely worked, my handwriting so shaky I could hardly read it myself. When I handed it back, Gloria looked at me, really looked, and said, "You okay, honey?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. What else could I do? They put us in a room with 4 other families. Bunk beds, thin mattresses, a single outlet everyone fought over. The walls were cinder block, painted pale yellow a long time ago, with chips and cracks that made patterns like continents. There was a window, but it faced a parking lot, where a single streetlight flickered on and off, all night long. That first night, I lay on the bottom bunk with Matthew on my chest, and Sophie curled beside me. Dad took the bed across from us. I listened to the sounds, coughing, crying, someone's radio playing low, the hiss of the radiator that never quite got warm enough. I kept thinking about the house, about Richard's face when he told me to leave, the cold satisfaction in his eyes, about Beatrice, who'd whispered poison in his ear for months, telling him I was a leech, that Dad was dead weight, that we'd suck him dry if he let us stay. I thought about Mom too, Isabel. She'd died 2 years earlier, and I still wasn't over it. None of us were, but Richard had taken it differently. He'd gotten hard, angry. He'd started talking about the farm like it was his alone, even though it had been in the family for 3 generations. Even though Dad's name was still on half the deed. He'd started making plans, big plans, talking to developers and lawyers and people in expensive suits who showed up at the house with briefcases and cold handshakes. 2 weeks after we got to the shelter, Matthew got sick, really sick. His fever spiked in the middle of the night, and his little body went rigid in my arms. His skin was hot to the touch, burning like he was on fire from the inside. I ran to the front desk, barefoot, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Gloria called 911. They took him to County General. The doctor said it was pneumonia, probably from the cold, from stress, from a system too young to fight back. They kept him for 5 days. I stayed in a chair by his bed the whole time, watching the monitors, counting his breaths, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Sophie stayed with a volunteer at the shelter, because I couldn't be in 2 places at once. Dad came once, but the walk from the bus stop nearly killed him. He sat in the corner of the room, wheezing, his hands on his knees, and when I told him to go back, he just shook his head. "I'm not leaving my grandson," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was the firmest thing I'd heard in weeks. That's when I realized how much we'd lost. Not just the house, not just the land, but the sense that we mattered to anyone, that we had a place in the world, that we were worth fighting for. When Matthew finally came home, wrapped in a hospital blanket with discharge papers I couldn't afford to pay for, I sat on the edge of the bunk and opened Mom's suitcase. I needed clean clothes, something to feel normal, but when I unzipped the inner lining, something I'd never bothered with before, I felt paper, folded paper, thick and official looking. I pulled it out carefully, my hands still shaking from exhaustion. Letters, documents, some in Mom's handwriting, some typed and notarized. I didn't understand most of it at first. Legal jargon, references to parcels and easements and water rights. But one phrase jumped out at me, written in Mom's careful script at the top of a letter addressed to me. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you need to know the truth." I read the whole thing that night, sitting under the flickering fluorescent light while everyone else slept. Then I read it again, and again. My hands trembled as I held the pages, and tears blurred the words. But I kept reading. Mom had separated the water rights from the land. Years ago. Quietly. Legally. She'd done it when the county was rezoning. When nobody was paying attention. When Richard was too busy expanding the farm to notice what she was doing. The old stone well on the property. The one that had fed the farm for generations. The one Grandpa had dug by hand in 1952. Wasn't part of the deed Richard inherited. It was mine. She'd left it to me in a separate trust. Filed with the county clerk, witnessed and sealed, the water rights. The only reliable source in a region that had been drying up for a decade, where wells were running dry and farmers were selling off their land because they couldn't afford to irrigate anymore. And Richard had just sold the land to a vineyards company, a big one, Salinas Valley Estates. They were planning to expand, to plant 20 more acres of premium grapes, to build a processing facility that would employ 50 people and put our little county on the wine map. They needed water, a lot of it, and they thought they had it, but they didn't. I sat there with the papers in my lap, and I didn't feel victorious. I felt numb. Then I felt something else, something sharp and bright and almost painful. Hope. Real hope. For the first time in months. The next morning, I borrowed a phone from Gloria and called a lawyer. His name was Martin Ruiz, and he worked out of a storefront office near the courthouse, the kind of place with Venetian blinds and a secretary who only came in 3 days a week. I told him everything. He asked to see the documents. I brought them in that afternoon, Matthew strapped to my chest in a carrier, Sophie holding my hand and swinging her legs in the waiting room chair. Martin spent an hour going through them, page by page, making notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding to himself, occasionally muttering under his breath. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were bright. "This is real," he said. "Your mother was smart, really smart. She knew exactly what she was doing. So what happens now?" "Now?" He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Now we make sure you get what's yours. It took 3 weeks to untangle the mess. Martin contacted the Vineyards Company, Salinas Valley Estates, and explained the situation. At first they didn't believe him. Then they got angry. Their lawyer called Martin's office and yelled for 20 minutes about fraud and bad faith, and how they'd sue everyone involved. Then their lawyers got involved, and everyone calmed down. The director of the company, a man named Victor Salinas, called me directly. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the tension underneath, the sound of a man trying very hard not to lose his temper. "Ms. Carter," he said, "we've reviewed the documents your attorney provided. They appear to be legitimate. They are legitimate. I understand, and I want to be clear. We're not interested in a legal battle. We're interested in a solution. This project represents years of planning and millions of dollars in investment. We have investors, employees, contracts. We need to move forward." I didn't say anything. I wanted to hear what he'd offer. "We need that water," he said. "Without it, our expansion is dead in the water. No pun intended. We've already invested close to $2 million. So here's what I'm proposing. We buy the rights from you, outright. Fair market value, plus a premium for the inconvenience. How much?" He named a figure. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to buy a house, to start over, to never worry about Matthew's medical bills again. Enough to put Sophie through college and still have some left over. But something in me hesitated. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of Mom's handwriting, the care she'd taken to make sure I had something of my own. Or maybe it was just that I was tired of being pushed around, tired of being told what I was worth, tired of accepting whatever scraps people threw my way. "No," I said. Silence on the other end. Then, "Excuse me? I don't want to sell. I want a partnership." Victor Salinas didn't laugh. He didn't hang up. He said, "Tell me what that looks like." So I did. I told him I wanted a house, something safe, stable, big enough for my family. Not a mansion, just a real home with a backyard where my kids could play and Dad could sit in the sun. I wanted a job, something with benefits, something I could do while my kids were in school, something with dignity, and I wanted a percentage, not a huge one, just enough that every bottle of wine they sold would carry a piece of what my mother had left me. A reminder that this wasn't charity. It was justice. It was what I was owed. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, hear papers rustling in the background. Then he said, "I'll call you back." He did, 2 days later, and he said yes. Richard found out a week after the contracts were signed. I don't know who told him. Maybe someone at the county office. Maybe one of the vineyard workers who'd heard the gossip and couldn't wait to spread it. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everyone else's business before they know it themselves. He showed up at the shelter, red-faced and shaking, and tried to push his way past Gloria at the desk. She called the police. They came fast. 2 officers who knew the shelter well, who'd made this run a dozen times before. They escorted Richard out. But before they did, he looked at me through the glass door and shouted, "You stole from me. That was my land. Mom left it to me." I didn't shout back. I just looked at him. And I thought about all the times he'd told me I was worthless, that I was dragging the family down, that I should be grateful he'd let me stay as long as he did. I thought about Beatrice, whispering in his ear, feeding his anger like kindling, telling him that family was just dead weight, that compassion was weakness. And I thought about Dad, sitting beside me now, his hand on my shoulder, steady and warm. "It was never yours," I said quietly. "It was hers, and she gave it to me." The police took Richard away. Later, I found out he'd tried to forge documents, to claim the water rights were part of the original sale. He'd altered some old paperwork, tried to backdate signatures, made up invoices that never existed. The Vineyards Company had already flagged the discrepancy, and when the county investigated, they found other things too. Fraud, tax evasion. Small stuff, but enough. Richard went to jail. Not for long. 18 months, maybe less with good behavior. But long enough for him to think about what he'd done. Long enough for the anger to burn itself out, maybe. Beatrice called me once, a few months later. She was crying. She said Richard had left her with nothing, that the house was in foreclosure, that she didn't know what to do. She said she was sorry, that she'd been wrong, that she'd let her own bitterness poison everything. I could have hung up. Part of me wanted to. But I thought about Sophie, about the way she still asked if Uncle Richard was okay, about the way she didn't understand why people hurt each other. So I told Beatrice where the shelter was. I told her Gloria's name. I told her there was space, if she needed it. She didn't thank me. She just hung up. But 2 weeks later, I saw her there, sitting in the same plastic chair Dad had sat in that first night, looking small and lost, and older than I remembered. Sophie saw her too, and before I could stop her, she ran over and gave her a hug. Beatrice started crying again. This time, I think it was different. This time, I think it was real. The house Victor Salinas helped me find was small, but it was ours. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with an old oak tree and a swing set the previous owners had left behind, a porch where Dad could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. The kitchen had yellow tiles and a window that let in the morning light. Sophie picked out the paint for her room, lavender, with white trim. Matthew got the room next to ours, close enough that I could hear him if he woke up in the night. The job Victor gave me was in the tasting room, greeting visitors, telling them about the wines, about the land, about the water that made it all possible. I was nervous at first, worried I'd say the wrong thing or embarrass myself, but I was good at it, better than I expected. I liked talking to people, liked hearing their stories, liked the way their faces lit up when they tasted something they loved, and after a year, they promoted me to community outreach. I started working with local farms, helping them navigate water rights, sharing what I'd learned. It felt like something Mom would have wanted. It felt like her legacy, carried forward. The wine they made with the well water became their signature line. They called it Isabel's Water, Victor's idea. He said it honored the woman who'd made it all possible, the woman who'd had the foresight to protect something precious when no one else was paying attention. Every bottle had her name on it, printed in elegant script beneath a drawing of the old stone well, and every bottle sold meant a small check in my account at the end of the month. Not enough to get rich, but enough to breathe, enough to plan, enough to hope, enough to take Sophie to the dentist without worrying about the bill, enough to buy Matthew new shoes when he outgrew the old ones, enough to live like a person, not just survive. Dad got better too, not physically. He was still old, still tired, still had days when the arthritis made it hard to get out of bed, but he smiled more. His eyes cleared. He started going to a senior group at the community center, a weekly gathering where they played cards and complained about their grandkids, and traded stories about the old days. And he met a woman there named Dolores. She was kind, patient, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She didn't mind that he moved slow or that his hands shook when he tried to shuffle the deck. They'd sit together on the porch, drinking iced tea, talking about things I didn't need to hear. It was the first time I'd seen him happy since Mom died. Really happy. The kind that comes from inside instead of just being polite. And then there was James. I hadn't thought about him in years. Not really. He'd been my first love, back when I was 19 and stupid, and thought the world was bigger than it was. We'd met at a county fair, of all places, standing in line for funnel cake. He'd made a joke about the powdered sugar, and I'd laughed. And that was it. We'd talked for hours that night, sitting on the hood of his truck under the stars, and I'd felt like I'd known him my whole life. We'd talked about running away together, about getting married, about buying a little place of our own, and raising chickens and living off the land like people used to. All the things young people talk about when they don't know any better. Then he disappeared. Just gone. No note, no call, nothing. One day he was there, telling me he loved me, and the next day he wasn't. I'd cried for weeks, then months, then I'd forced myself to stop. I'd convinced myself he'd never cared, that I'd been a fool, that love was just a story people told themselves to make the loneliness hurt less. But one night, sitting on the porch with Dad, I found out the truth. We were alone, just the two of us. Sophie and Matthew were asleep inside. The air was warm, and the sky was full of stars, the kind of night that makes you feel small and safe at the same time. Dad cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to say something hard. "Emily," he said, "there's something I need to tell you. About James." I looked at him. My stomach tightened. What about him? He didn't leave because he wanted to. My chest felt like something was pressing down on it. What do you mean? Richard paid him, gave him $5,000 and told him to disappear. Told him you'd be better off without him, that he'd ruin your life, that he'd drag you down, that you'd never amount to anything if you stayed with some poor kid who didn't even have a college degree. James didn't want to go, but he was poor, Emily. Really poor. His mom was sick, and they were about to lose their house. Richard knew that. He used it, made it sound like he was doing you both a favor. So James took the money and left. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The stars blurred, and I realized I was crying. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know until after your mother died. She'd found out, confronted Richard, made him swear he'd never do anything like that again. But she didn't tell you because she didn't want you to hate your brother. She thought maybe one day you'd forgive him. That family was more important than old wounds. I didn't forgive him. I don't know if I ever will, but I did something else. I found James. It took a private investigator and 3 months of searching, but I found him. He was living in a small town in northern Mexico, working in a furniture factory, barely getting by. He'd gotten sick, tuberculosis, the kind that hollows you out if you don't treat it right, the kind that kills you slowly if you're too poor or too stubborn to see a doctor. He was alone. No family, no friends, no one who cared if he lived or died. When the investigator sent me his address, along with a photo, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked 20 years older, thin and gray, and bent like a tree that had weathered too many storms. I bought him a plane ticket. I didn't ask if he wanted to come back. I just sent it, along with a letter that said, "You didn't leave because you wanted to. Come home." He came. 3 weeks later, I picked him up at the airport. He walked through the arrivals gate with a single duffel bag, and when he saw me, he stopped. Just stopped, like he couldn't believe I was real. I walked up to him and I said, "I know what happened. I know why you left, and I forgive you." He broke down right there in the middle of the terminal, and I held him while he cried. People walked past us, giving us space, and I didn't care. I just held him. I brought him back. I helped him get treatment at the county clinic, helped him find a place to stay. A small apartment near the vineyard. Nothing fancy but clean and warm and safe. I helped him remember what it felt like to be cared for. And slowly, carefully, we started talking. Not about the past, not at first. Just about now. About Sophie, who looked so much like him it hurt. About Matthew, who'd started walking and wouldn't stop. Who ran through the house like a tiny tornado and laughed at everything. About the life I'd built from the wreckage Richard had left behind. James cried when he met Sophie. He knelt down so he was at her level, and he held her hand, and he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I missed so much." And Sophie, who didn't understand any of it, who only saw a kind man with sad eyes, just smiled and said, "It's okay. You're here now. We didn't fall back in love, not the way people do in movies, with swelling music and perfect timing, but we built something. Slowly, carefully, like you'd build a house after a fire. A friendship first, then a partnership, then something more. He got a job at the vineyards, working in the fields, and he was good at it. He was patient, careful, the kind of person who noticed when a vine needed water or when the soil was too dry. He had a way with plants, people said. A way of seeing what they needed before they knew it themselves. People liked him. I liked him. And eventually, I loved him again. Not the wild, desperate love of 19, but something steadier, something real, something that could survive a winter. By the time Sophie turned 10, we had a rhythm. James lived in his apartment, but he was at the house most days. He helped Matthew with his homework, taught Sophie how to fix a bicycle, sat with Dad on the porch, and listened to his stories about the old days, about building the farm, about Mom when she was young and full of dreams. We weren't married. We didn't need to be. We were a family, and that was enough. The cooperative I'd started, the one that helped small farms navigate water rights, grew bigger than I'd expected. We had 12 members by the second year, 20 by the third, 40 by the fifth. We held workshops at the community center, brought in lawyers who volunteered their time, shared resources and information and hope. Some of the families were people I'd known my whole life, people who'd watched me grow up, who'd come to Mom's funeral and brought casseroles and hugged Dad and told him it would be okay. Others were strangers who'd heard about what we were doing and wanted to be part of it. We called it the Isabel Carter Water Trust, and we put her name on every document, every newsletter, every sign we hung in the meeting room. Victor Salinas came to one of our meetings once. He stood in the back and listened to me talk about easements and conservation, and how to protect your rights without losing your land. When it was over, he came up to me and shook my hand. His grip was firm, respectful. "Your mother would be proud," he said. I nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight. But I believed him. I hoped he was right. Richard got out of jail after 14 months. I heard about it through Dad, who still kept in touch with a few old friends from the farm. Richard didn't come looking for me. I don't know if he felt guilty or angry or just tired, but I heard he moved to another state, got a job doing construction, kept his head down. Someone said he'd joined AA, that he was trying to get sober, trying to make amends. Maybe he changed, maybe he didn't. I don't know. And honestly, I don't need to. Some doors you close and they stay closed. That's okay. Beatrice stayed at the shelter for a while, then got a job at a grocery store stocking shelves. It wasn't much, but it was something. She started attending a church group, found some friends, started to rebuild her life piece by piece. One day, she showed up at the house with a small gift for Sophie, a bracelet she'd made herself, woven from colored thread, simple but beautiful. Sophie wore it for weeks, even in the bath, until the colors faded and the threads frayed. I didn't say much to Beatrice, but I didn't turn her away either. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a process. And sometimes, it's just letting someone exist in the same world as you without wishing them harm. The vineyard kept growing. Isabel's water won awards. Bronze at the state fair, silver at a regional competition, gold at a national tasting in Napa. People came from all over the state to taste it, to hear the story, to see the land and the old stone well that had started it all. Victor put a plaque next to the well with Mom's name on it, and a line from one of her letters. Water is life. Protect it like you would your own heart. And every time someone asked me how it felt to go from homeless to successful, I told them the truth. It didn't feel like success. It felt like survival, like justice, like finally understanding what my mother had been trying to tell me all along. The water wasn't just water. It was a lifeline, a second chance, a way to turn something broken into something beautiful. It was proof that the things people overlook, the quiet decisions, the careful plans, the love that doesn't announce itself, those are the things that save us in the end. Sophie graduated high school with honors. She gave a speech at graduation about resilience, about how her grandmother had taught her that the most important things in life are the ones you protect when no one's watching. I sat in the audience with James on one side and Dad on the other, and I cried so hard I couldn't see. Matthew was 13 by then, tall and awkward and full of questions about everything. He wanted to be a marine biologist of all things. He'd never even seen the ocean. But James and I took him one summer, drove all the way to the coast, and we spent a week collecting shells and watching the waves and talking about the future. On the last night, sitting around a fire on the beach, Matthew asked me if I was happy. I looked at him, at his serious face, and his eyes that saw too much for a kid his age, and I said, "Yes, I am," and I meant it. If this story touched you, I hope you'll share it. Not because it's mine, but because it's a reminder that even when the world tries to bury you, there's always something beneath the surface worth fighting for. Something your mother planted, something your father protected, something that waited in the dark until you were ready to find it. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories about real people who found a way through the dark, who turned their pain into purpose, who discovered that the smallest act of kindness, the quietest gesture of love, the thing someone leaves behind when they're gone, that's what saves us. That's what my mother left me. Not money, not land, but the belief that I deserve to survive, to thrive, to rise up from the snow with my children in my arms and my father by my side and say, "We're still here, and we're not going anywhere. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one."